Thank you so much, Paul Morland, for joining us. Now, on Sunday, there is going to be some important elections in Germany. What do you think the result of those elections will be? And can you talk about some of the political issues facing Germany at the moment?
Well, I speak as a demographer, and that's what I normally talk about, but I am, as well as British, a holder of a German passport. I have an interest in Germany particularly, and I fear the outcome of the elections is going to be a gross coalition of everybody except the AfD. There's this idea of the firewall, I think it's called the Brandmauer, the idea that the supposed far right is being kept out of power. And as that movement grows, for good or ill, the need is for an ever larger coalition of everybody else. And I think that has two problems. The first is the coalition of everybody else is just too incoherent to tackle the country's problems. And the second is that if that is the government, if that is the establishment, then the only other party which is in opposition will by definition grow and grow and grow. I think it's a very short-sighted and foolish policy. And I've just written an article in the Daily Telegraph saying that German electors and German politicians need to think much more broadly about what their problems are and have the courage to vote for the parties that they think can actually solve those problems and no longer be haunted to the same extent by what happened between 1939 and 1945. Whilst that shouldn't be forgotten, and my own family were refugees from that disaster, it cannot hobble. Germans should be conscious of it, but it shouldn't hobble how they vote, and it shouldn't hobble how they build coalitions.
And this issue particularly comes into focus on immigration, because there's this argument from some that Angela Merkel basically opened the borders because she felt guilty about, not helping people, and maybe that guilt goes back to the Second World War. So do you think the Germans need to sort of get over that and say, actually, it's important to put the country first again, that there's nothing to be ashamed of about, to be German and to support German interests? Well,
again, I do think people need to remember what happened and be conscious of it, but there isn't a very simple and single set of lessons that can be learned from it. So, for example, by opening the door to hundreds of thousands of Syrians, we know that in Syria the government has for generations brainwashed the people into anti-Semitism. It's not just anti-Israel. The Jewish community of Syria was long ago purged. There are effectively no Jews in Syria today. There was once a very large community in Aleppo, in Damascus. And when Syrians turn up in Germany, they don't suddenly lose their prejudices against Jews. And life for Jews in Germany, I know intimately. I know German Jews. One of my daughters was living in Germany for a year and was very closely associated with the Jewish community there. Life is becoming harder as the streets become more and more anti-Semitic. And that is a mix of the far left and the Islamists. I'm not saying every Muslim immigrant to Germany is an anti-Semite, and I'm not saying that everyone on the left is. But there is this very nasty far left green coalition, which you hear in the demonstrations in Germany, you see it on the streets, you see it when you go past any kind of Jewish institution which needs armed guards. And what Merkel has done, there are many reasons why Germany should not have opened its doors to mass immigration from the Middle East. But among them is the fact that it's made life more and more difficult for German Jews. And if Germany has any intention of retaining the modest rebirth of Jewish life, which it's seen since 1945, it can't do that while having an ever greater number of people from deeply anti-Semitic, misogynistic cultures.
Can you talk a bit about how Germany, Europe and Britain have changed over the last 2 decades in terms of our ethnic demography?
Using the internet without a VPN, a virtual private network, is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. This video's sponsor is Private Internet Access. They are the VPN to help keep you safe. Click the link in the description below to find out why over 30 million people have downloaded PIA to protect themselves online. A virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and helps keep your data private. When you're browsing the internet at home, you give up a large amount of data to businesses, to shops, and indeed to social media giants too. Hackers have the ability to steal your personal data with ease, including sensitive information such as passwords, keystrokes, and even your personal photos. Private Internet Access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection to keep your data out of the hands of cyber criminals. And it's not just hackers either to be concerned about. Information can be censored too. When Canada passed their C-18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news and content you love. Private internet access is available for Windows users, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one PIA subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. And we've got a huge GB News discount for you too. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get a massive 83% off PIA. That's under £2 a month, the price of a coffee, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free on top. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee too. Visit piavpn.com/GB News to start protecting yourself digitally today.
Well, it's very interesting you say 2 decades. If you go back to 1997, which was when Blair came in Britain, I can't tell you the exact number from the latest census. The census would have been the 1991 census. But at that point, the country was perhaps 94% white British. I say white British. One almost feels one needs to apologise for the term, but it is a term on the official census. When you get the census, you tick a box. And the government, in its wisdom, has allowed us the term white British. So we're allowed to say white British. Thank you very much, Her Majesty's government. And 90+% of people in those days tick that box. And ethnic minorities existed. They were reasonably well integrated. I think if you have a relatively small number of people over a long period of time, many from adjacent cultures, into a country that is proud of its origins and its history, warts and all, then it's manageable. If you have a mass immigration, very largely from countries with very little in common with us ethnically or religiously or culturally, and at the same time you say, thank you so much for coming, you have culture, we have no culture, you are somebody, we are nobody, you have a proud history, we have a history to be ashamed of, then integration is absolutely impossible and society will break down. And when we see that small 6, 7, 8% ethnic minority growing to up to 20, 25% and inevitably growing faster and faster. Inevitably, I say, because there seems to be no intention on any part, either of the Labour Party or the Tory Party, to do anything about mass immigration, legal or illegal, then I think we are on the way to societal breakdown.
What about the numbers? I want to hear the numbers. So what are the trends? For example, will Britain become a minority white British country within the next 50 years?
Oh, it's less than 50. I would say within 30 years. The current level of immigration, if you bring 1 million people in a year, and that's net, it's more than 1 million, and you have some Brits going overseas. Now, of course, there is a bit of a movement. There are some immigrants who come and go. But there's no doubt. I mean, there's also the question of how quickly people assimilate. People from Europe become white British. And my own parents were Germans, and I identify as white British on the census. So there are all sorts of questions around that. But at the level of 1 million people a year, and for all the talk of smash the gangs and immigration controls, I don't see that significantly changing under either of the two main parties. Then I think by 2050, at least the majority of children in this country will be non-white British, and quite possibly of the whole population. And this is why, as a demographer, a point I keep making is that if you want the economy to grow, if you want a balance of people of working age and the retired, and if you don't want mass immigration, then you have to have larger families. People actually have to take the responsibility themselves of saying that they will have 2 or 3 children if they can. And of course, there are cultural reasons they don't, there are economic reasons they don't. I think the government's responsibility is to help them. If we don't have reasonably sized families, then inevitably we will either decline as an economy and decline as a nation, and we see this happening in Japan, aging, less and less creative, more and more government debt, or we will have to continue to bring in large numbers of people from overseas. Now, in the past, we've largely brought them from, again, I use this term, adjacent cultures, Poles, Irish people who very quickly assimilate or go back home. The problem is that countries which are culturally adjacent, take Poland and Ireland, fewer and fewer 20-somethings because they have low fertility, a smaller and smaller economic gap, so less and less incentive for them to come here. And so we have to take more and more people from the fewer and fewer countries with very high fertility rates. And those are countries which are not only culturally very different from us, but where human development is very low, education is very low, and so they will be more and more of a burden on our economies rather than a benefit.
If I ask politicians whether they're concerned about this ethnic demographic change, almost all of them will say, it's an irrelevancy, doesn't matter to me. But do you think that is important? Is it something at least noteworthy of talking about?
I think a nation is many things. One of those things in the classic literature on nations and nationhood is what's called a myth of common ancestry. That doesn't mean that we are all necessarily descended from the same group of people, but there's a myth. It's believed to be the case. In the case of Britain, it's very much the case because there's very little inflow into the British Isles from even the Anglo-Saxons. The Normans are small in number, the Anglo-Saxons, until actually the Second World War, even the 1990s, to the point that since 1997 we've had more immigrants every year than we had in the whole period from the Anglo-Saxons arriving to the Second World War. So the idea that people are broadly descended from a common group of people, and that people have come in, the Huguenots, people like my own ancestors, my own parents coming in the 1930s in small numbers, and they have assimilated to some extent. They maybe keep their own customs and cultures to a degree, but they are assimilating to a larger number of people who do have their origins in these islands. I think it's a very important part for most nations of their sense of identity, their sense of continuity. And I think if you lose that, it's very nice to talk about British values, but I think if you lose that, the danger is that we don't have a coherent society and that people feel something very critical has been lost. And I don't know if that is actually doable, if you can actually function in the long term as a nation state when you lose that sense.
It's interesting, but the contrast I get from speaking to politicians about that very controversial question and just ordinary members of the public is stark. You know, and I'll speak to old people on the streets of England and they'll say, the country doesn't feel like it was when I grew up. It's not England anymore. It's not Britain anymore. The amount of times people have told me that just speaking across the country, asking them questions about immigration is staggering. So there does seem to be a bit of a distance between the members of the political elite and the native population on this question.
Well, the extraordinary thing is that this point of view that a nation is a continuity, even if there's an accretion, some people leave, some people go, but there is an essential continuity, is not only in the classic literature on nationalism, but it's believed everywhere else. It's believed in Japan, it's believed in Korea. If you said to people in Japan, don't worry, you're not having children, but people are having children in Burundi, ship them in from Burundi and they'll really be just as Japanese as you, people would look at you as if you were mad. In Tunisia, they're very concerned about mass immigration from sub-Saharan Africa, diluting their Arab North African identity. A lot of those people move through Tunisia or elsewhere. But it seems that almost every culture and almost every country has permission to say this sense of continuity. However tolerant we are, however much we accept limited number of immigrants and we allow them to assimilate, the idea that that is somehow unsayable and unpermissible is a very white Western thing. And I think when I say it's a white Western thing, you're absolutely right. It's not in the public as a whole. It's deeply embedded in the political class. And it seems to go across, as you know, more than anybody, across the whole political spectrum. And I think it should be challenged.
How do we reverse this demographic change? I know you said the Conservatives and Labour don't seem particularly interested in tackling the problems of mass migration and illegal migration, but perhaps Reform does, and Nigel Farage's party, they say that they're more in favour of border restrictions and so on. Maybe they have a chance of winning the next election or the one after that. So what would be your advice to a future government that wanted to seriously look at this demographic shift and try and reverse that shift? I know you talk about having babies, that's also a key part of it, but what else can you do to try and reverse this trend?
Well, I think it has got essentially it's got two parts. If we keep having a lower and lower fertility rate, we will have a hole at the heart of our economy which cries out for immigration. That drive, I've spoken to a SPAD, a political advisor for a senior government minister, who says, you won't believe the pressure from business. That pressure is going to be there until we create our own future. If we don't want to create our own future, we don't want to have our own children, if we fall foul and believe the myths about we're destroying the planet, or if we create a political society in which it's not easy and helpful and culturally acceptable for people to form families, we're finished one way or another. So I don't want to dismiss that side of things. It's absolutely critical that people do have children, and that people from all communities have children. You know, it's not just a white thing. If you actually look at Jamaica, they have a very, very low fertility rate, and the West African community here, the West Indian community here, is the only minority that actually declined at the last census. So it's not, you can't have pronatal policies that are specific to one ethnic group or another. It needs to be across the piece. We as a country, now a multiracial country, need to be reproducing ourselves. I think on immigration, the idea that we cannot control our borders if we want to is absolutely ridiculous. And the idea that we cannot repatriate people who have come here illegally, whose first act on stepping on British soil is to break the law. The fact that we're so hobbled, or politicians so hobbled by the courts, by the civil servants, that too is ridiculous. If we actually want to have a demography that is essentially British, if we don't want to say we're airstrip one, anyone can come, anyone can go, we're just a random collection of people who happen to be here, then we need to address both the question of birth rates and the question of borders.
So on the question of borders, obviously, number one easier solution is stop migration, right? That should be the first lever that we can pull. On illegal migration, as you say, deporting illegal immigrants, I think there's more than 1 million in Britain. That seems to be the second lever to pull. Well, what about the people that perhaps we don't want here in the long term who have been given indefinite leave to remain or even British citizenship or they're just on a visa? Do you think that we should encourage them to leave in some way, perhaps if they're criminals, for example, or they haven't assimilated into the culture? You know, I know I was speaking with Ben Habib, former Reform Party politician, and he said we should encourage people to leave with financial incentives. I know that in Sweden they've started to look at some of these policies. So what do you think about this idea of remigration of those people?
I think there is a sense of the liberal state, whereby once someone has citizenship, they have citizenship, and they are equal citizens. And I would uphold that. I don't think you can say, here we have two nasty criminals, one has a grandfather from somewhere else and one hasn't. So the one who has will encourage to go back, and the one who... I don't think you can do that once people become citizens. At least I don't feel you can. Other people may feel differently. But I do think that as well as limiting the number of people who come, and as well as deporting people who've come here illegally or who aren't British citizens who break the law, or other sets of criteria we could use, I think the other thing that's absolutely essential is for us as a country to be proud of our past, to have a story to tell. And just as when my parents came to this country in the late 1930s, they were told, you're in the best country in the world, you're very lucky to be here. We have a proud history. We don't need to varnish it. We know there are good things and bad things, but nevertheless, like any other country, we have a history with good things and bad things, but we're proud of who we are. We know who we are. And if you're here, this is the culture, the country, the history to which you proudly assimilate. Then I think we could absorb those who are already here. I think the idea of dividing one's citizenship depending on ethnic origin is something that I would not find acceptable, and I don't think will ever happen.
But take this idea of citizenship to one side. What about the many millions of people who are here on visas or, you know, on the path to citizenship for indefinite leave to remain?
If people are on a path to citizenship and not there, we have no legal obligation to give them citizenship. So the question then would be, why would you want to give them citizenship? Now, there are demands in the labour force, of course, and there may need to be continued immigration to meet certain demands for work. But there are very many ways to do that do not involve people necessarily staying here indefinitely. The Germans had a Gastarbeiter program back in the 50s and 60s. As long as we're relatively attractive to immigrants to come and work for a few years, we do not need to give people leave to stay here. But I would say two things. First of all, don't bring people into work and then say thereby, right, they can stay forever and get citizenship. And the second thing I'd say is if we do need people, because we haven't had enough children, it will take a while for our pronatal policies that I hope we'll adopt eventually to work through. In that interim period, if we need workers, then not only do we bring them in a way where they come, they're welcome, and then they leave, but also we have a laser-like focus on who we're bringing in. And we don't say for every worker who comes, we'll bring 4 or 5 dependents. So I think we need to have a pronatal policy, we need to have a much tougher view on who gets citizenship, and we need to focus, when we do bring people into the country, on the needs of the economy rather than their own personal needs, which is very nice for them, but doesn't necessarily help Britain.
And just finally, on the pronatal policies, Does that really work? I mean, in Hungary it hasn't really worked. In other places it hasn't seemed to work from the government side. Is there any way of making these pronatal policies work?
Well, I just wrote a book called No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children. Forgive me for the plug. And in that, the penultimate chapter is what government can do for us, and the last one is what we can do for ourselves. The first thing government could do in this country is acknowledge we have a problem. We've had too few children below replacement level since the early 70s. No frontline politician has ever even spoken about it until Keir Starmer. And what did Keir Starmer have to say? I'm not going to tell women how many children to have, as if anyone was saying anyone should be forced. So he's actually taken a step back. So we could at least start the process in this country. There's a great debate in the literature about which countries have tried what's worked where. I mean, we've got, I think, Peter Costello speaking here at the conference today. He introduced the baby bonus in Australia in the early 2000s. It did have an effect. Some of what Gordon Brown did seems to have had an effect. Hungary has reversed its very low fertility rate for technical reasons, but had a huge rise in the marriage rate, which could lead to a rise in fertility. So I think government has a responsibility. But ultimately, if a people and a nation doesn't want to reproduce itself, loses confidence in its future, doesn't have children, however difficult the economic circumstances, then it's doomed. The only way we can rejuvenate our nation and our nation state is by British people having more children.
Paul Morland, thank you very much.
Thank you.